Good evening, everyone. Today, we'd like to share the results of a study, EFL Learners' Attitudes Towards Corrective Feedback, a comparative study across different language levels. This presentation was prepared by my colleagues Edith Hernandez Mendez, Moises Perales Escudero, and myself. Before we start talking about this study or the results of this research, I would like to reflect on this quote. Everybody makes errors. The difference between learning from them or not is the attitude we have towards them. Attitude plays an important role on many different aspects of our lives, right? So errors are not the exception. So the way we feel, think, or behave when we have to deal with an error can make the difference. Well, let's start with the definition of corrective feedback. According to Shin and Ellis, 2011, it refers to the feedback that learners receive on the linguistic errors they make in their oral and or written production in a second language. Recent studies have turned to the instructors' and learners' perceptions and attitudes towards corrective feedback, as they seem to play an important role in the use of such strategies, or even in the use of corrective feedback in the language classroom. Previous studies on corrective feedback have found divergent attitudes in instructors and learners towards corrective feedback, namely towards the type or strategies and their effectiveness. And this, of course, plays an important or has an important has important implications in the teaching and learning process. So some studies have been done, or many studies have been done about students' attitudes towards corrective feedback. Here I show you some of them, one by Brown, 2009, and Lee, 2013. In their studies, they found that students preferred to receive explicit and immediate corrections. Lister and other researchers in 2013, they found that the preferences and attitudes of learners are important because they can influence learning behaviors and inform better the instructors about learners' perspectives. Another one by Zhang and Raimi, 2014, where they said that the learners have positive attitudes toward corrective feedback as long as they are well informed about it, as long as they know at the beginning of the course that this correction is going to be provided and what is the purpose and the significance of it. A more recent study by Unsal Sakiroglu, 2020, found that learners would like to be corrected when they had errors, but the majority of them said that this should be in a nice and friendly way. Now, the objectives of this study are two. One was to characterize students' attitudes considering the attitudinal model of Schiffman and Canuck, 2004, which integrates the cognitive, affective, and cognitive components, as well as the corrective feedback model proposed by Lister and Ranta in 1997. Another objective was to compare the learners' attitudes across 4 different levels: beginners, basic, pre-intermediate, and intermediate. The theoretical perspective used for this study was Schiffman and Canuck model, as I mentioned before, where they have these 3 components: the cognitive one, which is related to the thoughts and beliefs an individual has about an attitude object, in this case about the correction. the affective one, which is the emotional response a person can have, and the cognitive one is about the behavior a person shows when this corrective feedback, in this case, is provided, how they act, what they do with it. Lister and Ranta's error correction model is also useful for this study, or was also useful for this study, because it gives us the sequence a teacher could follow when dealing with an error in the language classroom, what teachers can do about it, and how they can manage it. So in this sequence, they represent the error and the strategies that the teacher can use, and then the time, which is also important, the learner uptake, if the error is corrected or not by the learner, and then there are different options which this sequence could follow, which is the use of a different strategy, or if there is repair, could be reinforcement or topic continuation. The method used in this study is a qualitative one. It's a case study done in an English language center in the south part of Mexico. It was an interview, a questionnaire we did. We chose 4 students for each level: introductory, basic, pre-intermediate, and intermediate. They were chosen by convenience, and the total of these the total of the participants were 16 students.
Hello, now it's my turn to talk about the findings and discussion of our study. And for this, we have first the students' attitudes towards oral corrective feedback strategies. Here we can see that in the beginning level, learners are not very aware of the strategies used by the teacher. And we can see that they perceive, or the attitudes towards the different strategies increase according to the different levels. So as far as the level increases, there is a perception or of new strategies used. And this could be due to the awareness of their students and their experience from one level to the next one. Interestingly, the meta-linguistic explanation was used in pre-intermediate and intermediate only, whereas the explicit strategy with repetition and recast are used throughout all the levels. The strategies have been affected by the pandemic, according to the students' report, and also the use of online classes. The attitudes are mainly influenced by the affective component, as students prefer more the whole class provision of corrective feedback versus individually being addressed. And they also pointed out the way of providing corrective feedback as a factor that affects this provision of corrective feedback. So they have positive attitudes towards teachers who are tactful and who are not sarcastic, or who are not ironic, and who are easygoing. So we can see that there is a transition of more of neutral attitudes towards more positive attitudes by the end of the last levels. Now, with regard to the students' attitudes towards the type of error corrected, we have that the errors mainly corrected are pronunciation of phonetic, grammatical, and lexical ones, although in pre-intermediate the phonetic ones are less reported. And we can also see that there are positive attitudes in general towards all these type of errors corrected, but we can see that there are negative emotions shown towards the correction of phonetic errors, pronunciation errors. However, In the highest levels, we can see that the students prefer this pronunciation correction, so they have developed positive attitudes towards this type of errors. And now, regarding the students' attitudes towards their own uptake, or what how they react after receiving feedback, we can see that in intro level, learners are not aware of what they do after they receive the feedback, but they do have positive attitudes towards corrective feedback in general. In the rest of the levels, the learners do prepare after the corrective feedback has been provided. But not only that, they also look for extra information and they practice on their own. And they mentioned that this is mainly because of these pandemic times and because of online classes. So we can see that there are positive attitudes in all the levels towards the, the, the uptake. Now, as to the attitudes towards oral corrective feedback effectiveness, we can see that in intro and basic, the first levels, learners are not very aware of this effectiveness. However, the affective component, we can observe that plays a very important role in the attitudes towards the effectiveness of corrective feedback in all the levels. So students associate the effectiveness of corrective feedback with a good communication between the teacher and the students, a trustful environment, a good rapport between teacher and students, active, dynamic, and interactive classes. So only in pre-intermediate level, learners associated the effectiveness of corrective feedback with the strategy used mainly with the meta-linguistic explanation and also with immediate corrective feedback. So they pointed out that these strategies are very useful and they are effective indeed. Another object of attitudes that we analyzed was the person who provides the corrective feedback. And for this, we found that in intro and intermediate level, students reported that the teacher and their peers are the ones that provide corrective feedback, whereas in basic and in pre-intermediate, only the professor was reported, the teacher was reported. Uh, all of them show positive attitudes towards the provision of corrective feedback by the teacher. And in basic and intermediate, students, learners pointed out the difficulties that now they have or teachers have to conduct and help them with peer correction. And this is due to pandemic times and to classes online. Something very interesting was the attitudes they show towards peer correction. Uh, in all the levels, learners preferred the corrective feedback to be provided by the teacher. And the attitudes towards corrective feedback are conditioned mainly by the affective component. That is, if they trust their classmates, if they have a good relationship with them, and if there is this type of camaraderie between them. Otherwise, they don't like it and they don't prefer peer correction. Besides the affective component, we also observe that the cognitive component also affects their attitudes towards peer correction. And that is if they believe that their classmates have a good command of the language, or if they have good skills, language skills, or there is supervision by the teacher, so they have positive attitudes. Otherwise, they don't. The attitudes towards the teacher's or instructor's personality when providing corrective feedback was also part of our study. For this, we found that in all the levels, learners pointed out the importance of the teacher's personality and attitudes towards corrective feedback and how these affect their own attitudes. So they show positive attitudes towards teachers who are easygoing, who are sympathetic, who are patient, who are tolerant, and who maintain a good communication and a good rapport with them. They don't show they show negative attitudes towards those teachers who are sarcastic or who are ironic, who are not sympathetic with them. Finally, we have the students' attitudes towards oral corrective feedback in general, not towards a specific object of attitudes, but in general. And here we have that throughout all the levels, learners evidence positive attitudes towards corrective feedback, influenced mainly by the affective component, but also by the cognitive component. And this was interesting when talking about oral corrective feedback in general, because they highlighted the cognitive component. And they mentioned that oral corrective feedback promotes and fosters the language learning, and also it helps to prevent the fossilization of errors. For the pre-intermediate learners, which was an interesting finding, they found that oral corrective feedback promotes self-correction, and that this self-correction helps them to become independent and autonomous learners. So what we conclude is that our findings suggest that learners have positive attitudes in general towards oral corrective feedback. They welcome oral feedback in classes, but these attitudes are affected mainly by affective factors and to some extent by cognitive factors. So these ones mediate these attitudes. So we have seen that a good rapport with instructors and classmates foster better attitudes, and that the teacher's own personality and attitudes, okay, affect the learners' ones, the learners' attitudes. If teachers show positive attitudes, learners will show positive attitudes. We also found that pandemic times have affected oral corrective feedback negatively, as teachers are limited to use less strategies or to limit even the provision of oral corrective feedback. But on the other hand, this has also helped some students to develop independent learning and to become more autonomous. We also have another finding, interesting finding in general, which is that attitudes towards peer correction are negative in general in all the levels, and this is due mainly to affective and cognitive factors. Learners in the beginning courses, at least in the first two courses, are not aware of oral corrective feedback, and even in the highest levels, they are not that aware either, although a little bit more. So they are not aware of oral corrective feedback, the strategies, the effectiveness, but there is an increase of this awareness as far as the learner goes from one level to the next one. So there is an increase of this awareness. We have some suggestions then, considering these findings. We think that instructors should develop positive attitudes towards oral corrective feedback first, and then make the learners' attitudes dynamic. That means help students change their attitudes, their negative attitudes, to positive attitudes. We also need as teachers to sensibilize the learners towards oral corrective feedback and its role in the language learning. We need to make students aware of the different strategies of oral corrective feedback, of the purposes and objectives of oral corrective feedback and its effectiveness. We need to make them aware of what we expect from them, and also the advantages of using peer correction and self-correction. We need to implement oral corrective feedback from the very beginning, okay, throughout all the levels. we need to implement different strategies and teach those strategies to the students so that they can also use them when providing peer correction. And finally, we need to think and implement innovative ways to implement oral corrective feedback for classes online. Thank you very much.